the chapter 4 actually starts with is a fundamental question. So in our in our everyday life, these are the kind of questions that we regularly face. So if you have ever lived in a apartment house or or some kind of rental facility, you probably are familiar with this idea of rent control by the government. So what happens is that in many cities, government imposes something called rent control, where government says that the rent of a certain dwelling place cannot be over and above certain level. Most of the times, this kind of rent control is installed in cities where the demand for rental facilities are very high. So like New York City, like Seattle, like Indianapolis, like Atlanta, Georgia. These are places where rent control is instituted. Now, rent control is a very controversial government policy. Why? Because on one side, you might argue that rent control really protects you as a buyer of a rental facility, that you don't actually have to pay too much of a high rent price, right? So a lot of people would argue that rent control is a pro-poor policy, meaning that this policy really benefits the poor community of a certain city. That's so that people, even if you don't have enough income, you can still live in cities and do a lot of things. The other side of the story is that people argue that this rent control really hurts the suppliers who are supplying these rental facilities. So if you are a landlord and government says that there is a certain limit of beyond which you cannot charge anyone rent, so sort of like a rent ceiling, people argue that this really hurts the landlord because he doesn't get enough sort of profit from his rental facilities. So that is going to be the way we are going to look at government's role in the market, in the sense that we are going to look at situations where government really intervenes regularly, big time, like rent control, the one that we looked at. Sometimes we will talk about regularly we talk about another kind of government policy called price floor, which is sort of like the minimum price government sets below which the price cannot go down. The classic example of a price floor is minimum wage, where government mandates that your wages cannot really fall below a certain level. Are these good for the economy? These are really important questions. These are politically motivated, socially charged economic questions. So we need to really have a good feeling for these ideas. Okay. What we're going to do, not today, probably in the next class, is that we're going to show that whenever the government imposes something called a price ceiling, which we're going to look at in the next class, it has an effect on the total economic surplus of the economy, which we really don't know what it is at this point of time. But what we're going to show, and this is going to be the conclusion of this chapter, is that whenever there is some kind of control over the market, either it's a price floor or a price ceiling or whatever, it will always reduce the economic surplus of the economy. Now, this is a fairly extensive chapter. First of all, we need to define what surplus is. A surplus is a very common word, which we are going to use to really quantify the benefits and the costs of being part of a market. So the surplus, when you look at the word, is something that remains above what is used or needed. So you can think about a surplus food, you can think about some surplus time in your battery life, things like that. So economists use the word surplus very frequently to refer to the benefit that people derive from engaging in market transactions. So you could be a buyer and you could get involved in a market. You could be a seller and you could get involved in a market, and the idea of surplus really tracks your benefit of participating in a market. Let's sort of formalize this idea by talking about two different concepts of surplus that really focuses on two sides of the market. The first concept always starts with our buyer, which is called a consumer surplus. I have mentioned it many times. Some definitions are more important than others. This is an important definition. Let's read the definition together. Consumer surplus is the difference between the highest price of a consumer, the highest price a consumer is willing to pay for a good or service, and the actual price the consumer receives. Before we look at the implication of this definition, let us try to figure out what do we mean by the highest price a consumer is willing to pay. Oh, sorry. What do we know? Have we learned anything about your highest willingness to pay from any of the previous chapters? Let's sort of break that idea down, right? So we pay about $575 for an iPhone 6X. Why? Why would you pay $575 for an iPhone that only,
Because the benefits outweigh the cost per year.
Okay. Two critical words. So let's start with that. So we have learned in the very first chapter that as an irrational individual, whenever we are making an economic decisions, we are always thinking about the marginal cost and the marginal benefit of an action, right? For an individual, the marginal benefit is the benefit that you're getting from an action. The marginal cost is what you're giving up, like the sort of opportunity cost, right? You remember that. And we said that anytime a consumer is buying an iPhone, probably the marginal benefit is either greater than or equal to marginal cost, something like that. And I think we also added, and you can go back and check, that we will say that in terms of efficiency, a consumer always buys up to the point where marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost for him. So whenever you are paying $575 for an iPhone, the marginal benefit of buying that iPhone is exactly equal to that $575. Are we all clear on that? So you're arguing, you're convincing yourself that I am spending this $575 because this iPhone is worth it, right? Okay. What if you have an idea that you're gonna pay $575 for the iPhone? You take $575 in your pocket, go to Verizon, and you see that they are selling that same iPhone for $300.
You're very happy.
You'll be very happy, right? You would be very happy. So the point that I want to make is that sometimes the maximum price that you are willing to pay is not the same price that you actually end up paying, right? Because the price that you pay is determined by the market. That has got nothing to do with how much you are willing to pay for that good. Most of the times, as we will see, that the maximum price that you are willing to pay for a good is higher than the price that you actually end up paying when you are in a market. So, to begin with, this chapter is directly connected with the previous chapter in the sense that we are making a very strong conclusion. We are saying that being part of a market activity is good for us because it helps us to get this surplus. What is that surplus? The surplus is the maximum price difference between the maximum price that I was willing to pay and the price that I actually paid. Makes sense? So that will be our consumer surplus. Now, I guess when you think about the market, what is more obvious is the producer surplus rather than the consumer one. So what is producer surplus? Producer surplus is opposite to what we just talked about in the consumer side. Producer surplus is the difference between the minimum price our producer would be willing to accept and the price he actually gets from the market. That is interesting as well, right? Why? Because as a producer, your primary motivation to sell something in the market is to earn profit. Right? So why would a producer sell something in the market? A producer is also part of this rational behavior in the market. We say that a producer sells something in the market when the price that he receives is either greater than or equal to the marginal cost of his production, right? So if what he gets from the market is either greater than or equal to what it takes for him to produce that good, our producer would be willing to produce that good and sell that good in the market. Are we all clear on that? Again, in terms of efficiency, our producer usually sells the goods at a price where the price is equal to the marginal cost of his production, which is very different from the buyer. For a buyer, the marginal cost of buying something was the price. For a seller, the marginal cost could be the raw material cost. Okay? Now, just like the consumer, our producers sometimes can also benefit, because sometimes market will give him a price higher than what he was expecting. Right? And this could be as a result of a variety of factors. Right? If the good in question has a very high demand in the market, our seller could actually end up getting a higher price than the producer was actually expecting. If that happens, if the producer is surprised by the fact that the price he receives is higher than the price he was expecting, we could argue that that is also a surplus to our producer, a surplus to our economy. So we can think about two different kinds of surplus: a surplus coming to the consumer and a surplus going to the producer. And when we add these two ideas, we are going to get something called an economic surplus. Okay, let's look at this idea more concretely, because when we are trying to formalize this idea of surplus, we need to not only talk about one individual, but we have to think about what is happening to the entire market. And I think this chapter is probably one of the best written chapter of this textbook. So if you have some trouble understanding what we are talking about in the class, read the book. They explain it actually better than I do. Okay, so imagine the market has demand curve looks like this. Looks kind of weird, but stay with me. Imagine that there are a couple of people in the market, Teresa, Tom, Terry, Tim, 4 people. And the market demand is the sum of these individual demands, something that we have learned. And with that idea, let us try to understand how prices affect how much output gets sold in the market. For example, imagine that when the market price was 6, only Teresa is going to buy that. Does it make sense? When the market price was 6, the only quantity that is going to be sold in the market is 1. Right? When the market price goes down, let's say to $5, at 5, you are going to have 2 units being sold. As the market price goes down even further, you're going to have Teresa, Tom, Terry all joining, and the total quantity is 3. So this is law of demand, nothing fancy, right? As the market price goes down, more and more output gets sold in the market. More and more output gets bought in the market. Notice that when the market price was $6, the amount that the first person, Teresa, wanted to pay for that good was also $6. So when the market price is $6, does anyone gain anything from this market? She buys that, but does she get any kind of surplus that we just talked about? So here, when the market price is 6, there is no surplus. Make sense? But what happens when the market price falls to, let's say, $5? Let's now be very careful. When the market price is $5, 2 units of outputs are being sold, right? Tom and Teresa, they are both participating, right? Tom does not get any surplus, right? Because Tom wanted to pay $5, he's paying $5. The maximum price that Tom wanted to pay was $5, and you can see clearly that Tom was also paying that $5. But for the first person, there is a surplus. Teresa wanted to pay $6, she only pays $5 because the market is willing to sell her that good at the $5. So we could argue that the difference between what Teresa wanted to pay, which is $6, and what Teresa actually pays, which is $5, is her consumer surplus. Okay? We can repeat this idea. We can see that as the market price goes down from 5 to 4 to 3, each individual that are participating in the market gets some kind of surplus. We can add all those surplus, and if we add all the surplus of these individuals, we are going to get something called the consumer surplus for the market. In order to do that, we need probably a little bit more, okay? So in order to get a better measurement of consumer surplus, we now are going to make an assumption. We are going to make an assumption that rather than focusing on how consumer surplus changes when prices change, which we already learned, let's fix our price at some level. Let's imagine that the price is $3.50. Okay? So remember, this was Teresa, this was, I think, Tom, right? Whatever. There are people in different points, right? So imagine that the market price is $3.50. $3.50. Okay? So at that $3, let us now try to understand the surplus that buyers have in this market. We can see clearly that when the market price is $3.50, notice that this is Teresa is still buying 1 unit, but by buying 1 unit, this is the area between the maximum price that Teresa wanted to pay and the price that Teresa actually pays is Teresa's consumer surplus. Do you all see that? Now you can do the same thing for the second guy and figure out that for the second unit, when Tom was buying the second unit, he was buying 1 unit as well. He was willing to pay 5. He actually ends up paying 3.5. So this is actually his consumer surplus, the red area. Finally, there is also another person. I don't remember what the person is here. But that person also gains. I have another color, so that's good. I have 3 colors. That's his consumer surplus, right? The difference between how much he wanted to pay or she wanted to pay and how much he or she actually pays. So these different colored areas really indicate the consumer surplus that each individual gets by participating in the market. These are consumer surplus of individuals when they are participating in the market. When we add all of them together, we get market consumer surplus. For a much smoother supply curve, by the way, there is calculation. I think the numbers speak for themselves. We have already shown how they are calculated. So, I'm going to skip them because I actually drew them with different colors. With a more standard market demand curve, where the market demand curve is not crooked but a smooth downward sloping one, the ones that we looked at in the previous chapter. For a given market equilibrium price, let's say $2, you can see that at this market equilibrium price, the consumer surplus is this entire area which is below the market demand curve and above the market equilibrium price. Below the market demand curve and above the market equilibrium price. This entire area is the consumer surplus of the market. Now, you can see clearly that this is a triangle, right? So, if you know what A is and you already know what B is, let's call it B, and if you also know what C is, then consumer surplus is nothing but half times base times height of this triangle, which is half times base is BC and height is AB. Right? Are we all clear? Are you guys familiar with how to calculate the area of a triangle? This is very basic geometry, right? So we can now use some of the terminology from math to really get a good idea about how to calculate consumer surplus. And notice this is a fairly tight numerical concept. You can really calculate that. Make sense? I want to go back to two slides, and I want to point out to you something that we need to really remember before going forward. And this is the idea of something called marginal benefit. And I want to do this as a sort of a way of summarizing the idea of consumer surplus. So what is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is the difference between how much you wanted to pay and how much you actually end up paying. Okay? When we talk about the maximum price that a consumer is willing to pay, that idea is synonymous to marginal benefit from a previous chapter. Marginal benefit is the benefit that you get by buying that iPhone. And the reason why you are willing to pay $575 is because you believe that the marginal benefit of buying an iPhone is $575. So, our maximum willingness to pay for a certain good is equal to the marginal benefit of buying that good. So I hope you remember that, because that really connects this idea of surplus that we are calculating with the idea of efficiency from chapter 1. In chapter 1, remember we said that economic efficiency is going to be achieved when marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost. So, along the demand curve, the marginal benefit to a buyer is always equal to the marginal cost to the buyer. What do you mean by that? Imagine that you are drawing a simple demand curve, and that's a standard one. Let's say this is your demand curve. And when we draw a demand curve like that, we say that P1, at P1 price, my quantity demanded is Q1. That's how we have been sort of labeling our demand curve. But let's now take a moment to explore this idea. What do you mean by that when we are making the connection between P1 and Q1? Let's rephrase the statement. Let's rephrase the statement by saying that whenever the consumer wants to buy Q1 unit of output, the price that he is willing to pay is P1. Does it make sense? Does it make sense? Now I'm going to write something that is not in your slide, but it is very important that we remember them for your future courses. If we believe that the second statement that I just made makes sense, that P1 is the price that I am willing to pay when I am trying to buy Q1 unit, then this downward sloping demand curve is also my marginal benefit curve. And it is equal to my demand curve. So in a market, my demand curve and my marginal benefit curve are identical. They are both downward sloping. They are both showing negative relationship between price and how much I am willing to pay. With that idea, let us now move forward. If we have seen how the consumer surplus is calculated for each individuals, and formalize that idea by saying that for a given demand curve, for a given market price, consumer surplus is the area above the market demand curve and below the market demand curve. Below the market demand curve, so that's this area, and above the market price. So this triangle is my consumer surplus. Notice that this consumer surplus is now the difference between the marginal benefit and your marginal cost. For a buyer, the marginal cost is the price the buyer pays, and marginal benefit is represented by the downward sloping demand curve. So the gap between them is your surplus. Do you all see that? And when you add them up, it is the surplus of the market, because the market is nothing but a sum of all of us. Any question? Let's now move to the producer side. There is a very interesting example about broadband, and let's just skip that and just show you the data. The picture, which is, I think, is a little bit instructive. So these two economists, very famous people, looked at the demand for broadband internet by using actual data. So this is what they found. They found A. Do you notice where A is? They found A, they found B, and they found C. So if you can empirically find A, B, and C, you can literally calculate the consumer surplus. Okay? And the consumer surplus is again the shaded area below the market demand curve, above the market price. In your exam, you will be required to calculate consumer surplus. Okay, so let's now move on to the producer surplus idea. So the idea of producer surplus is very similar to the consumer, but from a completely opposite side, from the production side. For a consumer, their surplus was the difference between their marginal benefit and their marginal cost. Consumer surplus was the difference between the maximum price they were willing to pay and the price that they actually end up paying. Producer surplus is opposite to that. Producer surplus is the difference between the price that our producer gets from the market and the minimum price our producer wanted to charge for that good. Okay, now what do we mean by that? What do we mean by this minimum price? So I'm going to draw a simple supply curve like this one. And we have seen this many times before, where our supply curve really tells us the amount that producer wants to sell at a given price. That's how we have interpreted the supply curve. I will now reinterpret the definition of a supply curve. I will now say that if the producer wants to sell Q1 units of output, the minimum price that our producer will be willing to accept is P1. Does this reinterpretation of the supply curve make sense? Let me repeat the statement again. I will reinterpret supply curve by saying that if the producer wants to sell Q1 units of output, the minimum price that our producer will be willing to accept is P1. If we believe that this is true, by the way, why would our producer be willing to accept P1 when the producer is trying to sell Q1 units of output? Why is P1 the minimum price?
What would be the break-even price?
We don't know what that is. And let's wait actually 4 chapters from now to really reflect what a break-even price is. A break-even price is a very interesting concept, and you are right in your interpretation, but we need a different model to analyze that. Okay? Let's use more simpler terms to see what P1 is for our producer. Our producer wants to sell Q1 units of output, and we are saying that P1 is the minimum price that he is going to accept. What is P1?
Marginal benefits larger than its marginal cost.
Okay, so you are trying to interpret it in a slightly different way, but let's work with you. So he wants to look at the producer's decision also from a marginal benefit, marginal cost kind of analysis. And I think it makes sense, right? We believe that everyone is rational. So if the consumer is doing a marginal benefit, marginal cost kind of calculation, our producer should also be doing same thing, right? So what is marginal benefit to a producer? So what is benefit to a producer? Anyone? So the benefit to a consumer was the satisfaction or whatever he gets. Very difficult to quantify. But a benefit to a producer is very well quantifiable. What is that? It is true that whenever our producer really produces something, profit is what the benefit is. But we don't see profit here. Profit is a little bit of a compound concept because profit depends on three factors: price, quantity, and cost of production. What we can say that for a producer, the benefit is the price that he receives, right? Makes reasonable sense, doesn't it? The cost to a producer is the cost of production. Very simple, right? Does it make sense? So the benefit to our producer is the price he gets, and the cost to our producer is the cost that he incurs in producing that. And if we believe that our producer also utilizes a rationality behavior, our producer will produce where marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit. Does that answer your question? Now let's come back to our graph. If QP1 is the minimum price that our producer is willing to accept when he is trying to sell Q1 units of output, what is P1 to our producer? Absolutely. And what is that? What is the lowest price you would be willing to accept when you are trying to sell something in the market? The minimum price. You cannot earn a profit, a loss, right? That P1 is his cost of production, because if somebody is trying to offer you a price lower than your cost of production, would you really sell that product? This is connected with her argument that there is a profit argument there. We don't see profit at this point of time because we have not defined it, but we will. And we will see that this idea makes perfect sense when we look at it from a profit perspective. For now, we will say that a producer will never accept a price less than the cost of his production. So that will, in 4 chapters from now, will be called a break-even point. Okay, makes sense? The reason why I am spending a little bit of time trying to reinterpret our supply curve is because we are going to say that our supply curve is also the marginal cost curve for our producer. So our demand curve is the marginal benefit to our consumer. The supply curve is the marginal cost curve for our producer. This way of looking at demand and supply is very, very beneficial. Okay, so with this reinterpretation of our supply curve, let us now move on to our usual tactics. So imagine that there is a producer, and our producer has an upward sloping supply curve, and depending on what kind of market price our producer gets different degree of producer surplus. Let's start with the fact that when the market price is, let's say, $1.25, does our producer get any surplus? To make things a little bit more interesting, because our producer is very sensitive to price, how much production and supply will take place when the market price is $1.25? How much do our producers sell when the market price is $1.25? One, right? It's just one. And if the market price is $1.25, at that price, the producer has no surplus. Isn't that right? But if price rises up a little bit, let's say $1.40 or whatever, you immediately see that our producer starts getting some surplus. Why? Because the supply curve measures the minimum price that he was willing to accept. If he gets a price higher than that minimum price, he gets a surplus, a producer surplus. Okay? So, in the example, if the price is actually $2 rather than $1.25, $2 is the market equilibrium price. Notice our producer, when he sells the first unit, the total producer surplus he gets is this red shaded area. When our producer sells the second unit, the area B is the shaded producer surplus, the producer surplus that he gets by selling the second unit. Area C is the producer surplus that he gets by selling the third unit. Every time, producer surplus is the difference between the minimum price that he was willing to accept and the market price he actually gets. With a more formal or well-behaved supply curve, let's say the one that we are more familiar with, our supply curve looks like that, and with a given market price, let's say of $2, our producer surplus is the area, the shaded area, which is below the market equilibrium price and above the supply curve. Below the market equilibrium price and above the supply curve. And just like our consumer surplus, this is also a triangle. If we know what B is, which we actually do, right? The only point that we probably need to know is C, which we don't. If we know these 3 points, we should be able to calculate producer surplus as well, just like we calculated consumer surplus. So producer surplus is the area below the market equilibrium price and above the supply curve. Now, when we make these two ideas together, we are going to have something called economic surplus, which is the total surplus of the economy as the sum of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. Very simple idea. Before we move to that, we need to really sort of remember the true interpretation of consumer surplus and producer surplus. The reason why we want to calculate consumer surplus and producer surplus is not because we like math, or it's not because we like quantitative analysis, but consumer surplus and producer surplus tells us something fundamental about our economy. So let's read the interpretation, because these interpretations are going to be in your exam. So what is the consumer surplus really giving us? Our consumer surplus really measures the net benefit to our consumers, right? It's not a total benefit, it's the net benefit. The difference between the maximum price that he wanted to pay and the price that he actually pays. So it's actually his net benefit. When we add them up, consumer surplus is the net benefit of the consumers in the market. Similarly, our producer surplus measures the net benefit received by our producers from the market. So one needs to understand that consumer surplus and producer surplus is not measuring the total benefit, but total net benefit for the producer and for the consumer. When we add them, our economic surplus measures the net benefit of the economy. From which? From what? From what? So what does our economic surplus will therefore measure? It is measuring net benefit of the economy by being in an equilibrium, right? Because notice that all the calculations that we just did, consumer surplus, producer surplus, they were all based on a given market price. And that market price is going to be derived by the market. So one should see clearly that this consumer surplus and producer surplus could be a way to quantify the amount of benefit, the net benefit that we get when the market is in equilibrium. When the market is in equilibrium. And if this is true, then market equilibrium in conjunction with these surplus concepts can really tell us how much benefit an equilibrium gives us to the economy. Okay, what do I mean by that? Before we make that final conclusion, I think we are running out of time. So rather than make that final comment, I want to look at some questions. Okay, this is a straightforward question. The amount of consumer surplus is the difference between high and is answer is C. The next one is the consumer surplus measures the net benefit. The following definition of marginal cost is what? What is marginal cost? So A would be marginal benefit, right? What is marginal cost? Marginal cost is C, the extra cost of producing an unit of output. And finally, this one. This is a trivial one. It is talking about the producer surplus from selling the 40th cup. This is very important. It's very important to read questions. For the 40th cup, the producer surplus is that one, the difference between price the producer was willing to accept and the price our producer gets. So it's the difference between $2 and $1.80. So the answer is C, right? Do we all see that? So the producer surplus is the difference between minimum price that he is willing to accept, which is about $1.80, which is on the supply card, and the price that he actually gets, which is $2. So the producer surplus is 20 cents. Okay, thank you.